Now, one thing to be clear about, there are lots of causes of cognitive decline, and only one of them is Alzheimer's, but in the interest of time, we're going to focus on Alzheimer's disease. So we're going to look at the 4 major contributors to Alzheimer's disease and then how lifestyle habits cause these kinds of things. So the first thing is inflammation. Now, first of all, inflammation is a natural process of the body. It's your immune system responding to invading threats. Acute inflammation is redness and swelling at an injury site, which promotes healing. But chronic inflammation that's unrelenting is due to things like diet, stress, and bad lifestyle choices. The tissues are damaged instead of healed. And early in the process of Alzheimer's disease, in this time period when you don't know that anything's going on because you're not experiencing any discomfort, inflammation in the brain develops. And the cells that are responsible for housekeeping, collecting the garbage and discarding it in the brain, they become overwhelmed, and what you end up with is cell death and structural damage. So chronic inflammation, we'll look at what contributes to that, is a major factor. Another factor is oxidation, which occurs naturally when oxygen reacts with other substances. So a good example would be you chop up some lettuce, leave it on the counter, and it turns brown. That's oxidation. This results in the formation of free radicals, which steal electrons from neighboring tissues and cells. In the brain, free radicals take electrons from neurons and organelles and proteins and lipids and fatty acids and DNA, results in permanent damage. The brain uses most of the body's oxygen, so it's very vulnerable to oxidative reactions. The brain can address oxidation, it's designed to do it, but the problem is the brain becomes overwhelmed. And by the way, one of the things that I'll stress here is all of the parts of your body have enormous self-healing capacity, but that's assuming that you take good care enough of yourself that whole system isn't disabled by being completely overwhelmed. Okay, so next one. Glucose dysregulation, which is very common in the early stage of the disease. So glucose feeds the brain cells, and the development of insulin resistance causes high plasma glucose levels to build up. This results in inflammation and oxidation, which we just talked about, dysregulation of lipids, and tau phosphorylation leading to tangles. The more glucose dysregulation, the more pronounced it gets, the higher the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Diabetics experience more shrinking in the hippocampus or the memory center than other people, and are therefore more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And one thing that I'll mention, type 2 diabetes is one of the most preventable and treatable diseases that people in our culture develop. And it not only increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease significantly, it increases the risk of cancer significantly, which is why we should be paying a lot of attention to this particular issue. And then lipid dysregulation. Lipids are building blocks of cells and hormones and steroids, and they comprise 59% of the brain's dry weight. But high lipid levels lead to inflammation and oxidative damage, which are harmful byproducts. Cholesterol is a lipid that accumulates in the blood vessels and damages them, and therefore vascular disease is a big risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And you'll hear me say many, many times throughout this lecture and in other lectures related to the topic, what's good for the brain and what is good for the brain is good for the cardiovascular system. What's good for the cardiovascular system is good for the brain. So if you eat a heart-healthy diet, you're going to go a long way in protecting your brain from damage. The inability to clear cholesterol and lipids leads to the accumulation of amyloid plaques in the brain. And the most vulnerable people are people who have a particular gene mutation that we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes. However, that doesn't mean that there's no hope or there's nothing they can do about it. Genes are not a life sentence, they're just a predisposition. So, one thing to make clear, Alzheimer's disease is not an inevitable consequence of getting older. It's a process of degeneration. And the reason that it doesn't take place or it doesn't develop until you get older is because it takes a long time to injure yourself to the place where the symptoms become really evident. So the brain is resilient. This is one of the reasons why you could be doing terrible things for your brain and your cardiovascular system now and not notice anything. So here are some of the examples. There's a lot of redundancy built into the brain's design. Overlapping arteries that supply several regions of the brain and many, many neuronal pathways that do the same thing. And damage can occur in one area, and then the brain just compensates and has another area take over a particular function. The brain will create new pathways around an injured area. And just by way of example, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jeffrey Schwartz's work. He wrote a great book called The Mind and the Brain. And he cited studies where stroke patients have been able to regain strength in one side of the body by not moving it at all and forcing movement into the other side of the body during 20 hours, hours and hours and hours of therapy, which actually causes the brain to rewire itself and the injured side to be able to function again. So we have amazing capacity in the brain if we don't injure ourselves to the place of no return. So that's one of the reasons why it takes such a long time. 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are women. 1 in 6 women will develop it after age 65, whereas in men it's 1 in 11. And there are a lot of theories as to why this is true, but the obvious one is women live longer than men. And the other one that may be a factor, and this is changing thankfully, is that typically up until recently, women didn't do some of the mentally challenging things that men did for a living. Now, as I said, that's changed. We have just as many women going into medicine and law and science and that sort of thing, but there was a point in time when those industries were dominated by men. And again, I can't emphasize how much using your brain and really using your brain, learning things all the time, is a factor in protecting your brain from damage.